welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. My name is Jessica. I am your host today, and this is a really exciting episode. This is something we haven't done in far too long. It is a local interest history piece, and our subject lives right in the town next over. Please introduce yourself and tell us about where you live.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Jamie Arty, and I live in Oyster Bay, and I live in the home formerly known as the Chancellor's Mansion. It's a very old and historic home. So yeah, thank you. Excited to be here.
Well, as I mentioned before, we're really excited to have you. I know I stumbled upon this story through someone we both know mutually a few months ago, and I thought it was so cool. So first of all, let's kind of back up a little bit. The mansion that you live in now, I know you and your family restored, and what I want to know before we get into the history of the mansion, which is super, super cool, is were you looking to buy a house in that area in Oyster Bay when you found it?
So actually, I guess the answer would be yes. I guess what happened, it's so funny what happened. It was just the universe that kind of made this whole thing, happen. We were actually on our way to a birthday party, and my husband and I, we were driving right down Shore Road, and he said, wow, it's really nice around here. I love all the trees, and I like the big houses. I would love to live here. And I was like, yeah, it's really beautiful. And so we just thought, whatever. So then like a few weeks later, we were looking in the area, looking at some houses, and the way the streets are around here, there really aren't very many sidewalks. It's very like winding roads and like, big 300-year-old trees. And it's really, really beautiful if you love nature and things like that. And so we were lost, and the only place to pull over was like this like driveway, and that's where we saw like this for sale sign, but it was like partially covered by like overgrown English ivy. And we looked up, and there was this big old house that was like, covered in weeds, and you can tell it had been like neglected and hadn't been lived in for a really long time. And my husband goes, oh my God, look at that house. And I was like, oh, wow. Like, so that's like kind of how we found the house. So it was just, we weren't really necessarily looking, like we weren't looking for an old house, but we found it by accident because we got lost. So that's kind of how that happened.
It sounds like it was waiting for you, just like the way that you described finding it, and like the for sale sign, even it was like hiding from other people, and it was like, nope, you're living here. And so you restored this house from the ground up. Had you ever restored a house before?
No, never. My husband and I, we have no experience in this. And it's so funny because we really thought looking back then, we were so naive and so like misinformed and a little crazy, because we really thought that we would be able to just restore the whole house in 6 months. We were like, oh, 6 months, we'll be fine, And they do it on HGTV all the time. We've seen it on TV.
So easy.
Yeah. And then when we got in here, we were like, this is going to take way longer than 6 months.
Yeah.
So yeah, but in the beginning, we had no idea what we were doing. It was a lot of like trial and error, and we had no previous. The most that we did was we retiled a bathroom, like a
Right.
really small bathroom in our home. That was it. We didn't do any, like we didn't have any experience with historic restoration and restoration. Nothing. So yeah.
So one of the things that's crazy, because it's all well and good and awesome to talk about, like, hey, you found this house and you restored it and it's great. But the thing that's so striking is, and this is one of the reasons why I was like, we need to talk to them on the podcast. We need to talk to her, because this is such a great story. As you were restoring it, you discovered so much history behind this mansion. So, what was the first thing that you found out about it?
So I immediately, so it was almost like when we went to see the house, before we bought it back in 2017, I went home and I typed in the address and I wanted to find out, like the school district and all that stuff. And then I saw something on Instagram and it said Macun, and it said like Chancellor's Mansion. And so then I typed that into Google, and then I found all of this really cool stuff about this amazing man who was a judge, and he was an abolitionist, and I found out all these really cool things. And then I found out he hired this woman of color, an African American woman by the name of Sophia Moore, who somehow obtained her own freedom.
Wow.
Like, wait a minute, like this is like crazy. So then I started to do more research and I just went down the rabbit hole. I mean, when you get on Google and you start to find out about this and that, and then it just takes you to a whole other branch of information, and it just kept going and kept going. And the more I found out about the house, the more I was just like, oh my God, we got to get this house. We have to.
It's just so cool. And I feel like that part of especially Long Island history, because unfortunately, Long Island has other history with like redlining and stuff that's not so great. When you kind of look at just different communities that were essentially, unfortunately, built to keep people out. The fact that something so old and so historic has almost like a little glimmer of hope that's older, that predates the communities that perfected redlining in the 50s, is pretty incredible.
Right. And what's even more incredible is that it actually ended up in the hands of an African American family. It's like, it was just very rare, because homes that are this old, that are, at least 200 years old, they usually stay in the family for generations and generations. And so it was just remarkable to even be able to be a part of the history of the home, and be like the caretaker's
Sure.
historic home. And then to find out that, he was an abolitionist, and he was just such a badass. Like, he was just so and everything he did and he was also like an advocate for women's rights, because back then women really didn't have any rights. And
Right.
they, he was even advocating, like, he was really ahead of his time. And William Townsend McCune, I mean, I could just go on and on about how wonderful he was. And I feel so fortunate that this house, used to belong to him, and he built it. And we are now, fortunate enough to be the caretakers of it, and his legacy that he left behind. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
incredible. It really is. It is a glimmer of hope in not so good history on Long Island. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. And it's just like I was saying, like you're telling this story about getting lost and this house being there and the ivy covering the for sale sign. It really was like it was waiting for you and your family to be like, listen, this house belongs in your hands now. Like this is the future, and you can restore it and can, continue to further that.
Right.
So am I to understand that you
Yes,
have a graveyard in the back of your house?
we do. It's actually kind of in the front. So we actually own the
Even
old,
better.
we own the oldest cemetery in Long Island on the property, and it's the actual second oldest in New York State. So it's a lot of history. And actually, the Townsend brothers, the founders of the hamlet, are buried there, as well as Robert Townsend, who was the uncle of the actual Robert Townsend that was involved in the culprit spiring. So it even dates back to like the Revolutionary War. I mean, it has connections to George Washington and the culprit spiring. I mean, there's just so much there. Also, there's also a landmarker, a historic landmark for the Council Rock, which is a rock that George Fox, who was the founder of the Friends Society, would go there, and he would go there every year and do his sermons. And so that's pretty cool too, to actually have that on the property. Again, there's so much history here. It's unreal. It's unbelievable.
I am geeking out over that. That is so cool. I think that just the fact again that you're involved in restoring this history, and like you have all of it on your own property is just amazing. What's it like raising your kids there, and like having all of this history as part of your home?
It's really wonderful. And it's it was always kind of, in the beginning, it was really hard because obviously, the environment was so hostile. The house was so hostile. I mean, there was no running water, there was no electricity, the house was abandoned. It was just so much stuff in the house. And so it wasn't safe for children. So we had to fix all of that. But my husband and I, we always had the vision that once it was where we wanted it to be, it would be a wonderful place to raise children. And it is. And like I love the fact that, my kids can like run around on the property, and they're too young to really appreciate the history, but once they get a little older, I think that they will. If they're anything like me, they'll love history, which my 8-year-old does. He appreciates the history, not so much about McCoon, William Townsend McCoon, but more of the more recent history, which is about the Roosevelts and their connection to the house. So
Yeah, we haven't even gotten there yet.
there's so much. There's so much. So yeah. So the previous owner actually told me, she said, Roosevelt used to live here. And I just thought, oh yeah, Roosevelt has lived in every house in Oyster Bay. Like,
Literally.
of it, until one day, a really good friend of mine, we were looking to see, just because when you make statements like that, you have to have evidence to back it up. You can't just say, oh, Roosevelt lived here, and then just because he lived in the town doesn't mean he lived in your house or had any affiliation with
You
it.
don't get to put a plaque in your house, in every house in Oyster Bay, that says Roosevelt lived here.
Exactly. So we had to really, really do some serious research and find out, is this true? And then one day we found this newspaper clipping, and it was my house, my address, and it was about not the actual Theodore Roosevelt president, but his son, his first son, who actually moved here, and he had a housewarming party, and he had in it. it was in the newspaper, in several newspapers. And I said, bingo, that's it. That's what she's referring to. So my 8-year-old son loves that part because he gets to tell everyone, oh, Roosevelt Jr. lived in my house.
That's so cool. And if I remember correctly, from the video, you have taken pictures of your kids in the same places that the Roosevelt children have.
We have. Well, it's kind of in the same vicinity. Yes. So I'm a huge like before and after kind of past present person. I love taking pictures of a house, and then I love having like the picture of a house and then like 2 years later or 100 years later in the same spot, same house. I just think it's a cool thing to do, and you can make it a tradition. And hopefully my kids will do that with their kids one day in the same spot and just keep it going. But yeah, it's pretty cool.
Thank you so much for this. So if people want to find out more about the house or about the whole process or anything, is there a place they can follow you?
Absolutely. So I am on Facebook, and I have a private group that you can request to join, and it's called Making Over a Mansion. And that's also my IG handle, Making Over a Mansion as well. And I always put updates on what we're doing and before and after pics and, everyday life in the mansion and all of that, all the things.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this. We are so happy to have you as part of this restoration of the history of Long Island, and we hope to hear a lot more as you continue.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. And you're amazing to talk to. That was like really easy.
Thank you. Once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Our guest was
Jamie Arty with Making Over a Mansion.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.